because of long-term, low-dose ionizing radiation exposure, which does increase the risk of leukemia. So we did that. We published a report, actually a journal article that said, we ought to study nuclear power plant workers, because that's a population where, at least they're supposed to wear badges all the time. There's lots of nuclear power plants. The fleet was, even then, over 100 in this country, and tens of thousands of workers. That study was never done, mainly because the individual utilities can control whether they're going to let some government agency say, do a study of their workers, and they never did. I'm sure there are individual utilities that have studied their own workers, but those results don't usually reach the light of day. So in any case, that's a little more of my background. It was in that project that one of the pieces of that project was to survey all the cancer registries around the U.S. to see what kind of data they collected so that you could find out how many leukemia patients were in their catchment area, so to speak, where the area that they covered. And at that time, there were 37 cancer registries, not all of them states. Massachusetts, when we were doing this 1979 study, didn't have a cancer registry. So I got hired to set one up, and it was because of my experience knowing what all the other ones were doing that we established the Massachusetts Cancer Registry. And I'll tell you just one more story. One of the things we did is we monitored cancer in all the communities in Massachusetts, but we wound up seeing excess leukemia in Plymouth and the towns right around Plymouth, the 6 other towns that were in the immediate vicinity of the Pilgrim Nuclear Power Plant in the early 1980s. And 10 years earlier, there had been this is a General Electric boiling water reactor, there had been bad fuel that had built up gaseous radioactive material, and it was vented out one of the stacks, a couple of the stacks actually, of the Pilgrim plant. So that was the exposure in the early 1970s, shortly after it came online. It went through 1974, where they had to vent the radioactive gas, or steam, I think, actually. And then 10 years later, this spike of leukemia happened, and a couple of years later than that, a spike of thyroid cancer happened in the towns that included Plymouth and 6 towns around it. So I like to say that's where my hair fell out. I was the director of the Cancer Registry when we saw this. It wasn't from the radioactivity, it was from the political fallout of that. So in any case, that's why I guess I'm here today. I want to do 2 things. I really just wanted to remind people in the context of all this rush that nuclear power is carbon-free. And we have to worry about our carbon emissions. We do have to worry about our carbon emissions, but the industry has maintained, well, it's carbon-free when you split atoms, split uranium in a power plant and create heat that then becomes, spins turbines and becomes electricity. So isn't that the way forward? Well, I would like to remind the people who say that, and perhaps remind you, if you don't already know this, that there is radioactive exposure to the people who work in these power plants, but there's much more radioactive exposure, radiation exposure, back up the fuel chain, up the fuel cycle. In fact, in a typical power plant, if you were to do this analysis, which the NCRP, the National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurement, actually did this for a hypothetical big power plant, a gigawatt power plant. What portion of the radiation that affects people in order to produce the wattage that power plant produces, what proportion of that is at various stages in the fuel cycle? And the biggest proportion by far is in mining, the uranium mining. So it's to the miners themselves and the people who live near the mines or downwind from the mines. And in this country, that was typically in the Four Corners area of the Southwest, in New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and Utah area, was where the bulk of the mining got done. In this country, it's done in other countries, of course, as well. And populations and the miners in this country, that's disproportionately Native Americans, actually, in those 4 states, are getting the bulk of the radiation exposure from that stage. And the next greatest contribution in this hypothetical gigawatt power plant is milling, where the ore that's been mined out of the ground is crushed up and roasted, actually, and made into a uranium oxide that then is sent on to the next stage for being made enriched and being made into fuel. So again, the front end of the nuclear fuel cycle is where the bulk of the radiation exposure in a typically operating, say, hypothetical gigawatt power plant doesn't deal with the explosion that we just heard about, and the release of radioactive material as part of the hydrogen explosion that I guess Dave was showing, or Arnie was showing us. But let me just say that that's a fact that needs to be taken into account. And at the other end of the fuel cycle, after it's gone through the power plant's been stored, the fuel has been stored, and either is eventually taken to some underground repository, which doesn't exist in this country. There's radiation exposure, ionizing radiation exposure, all along that pathway, including the transportation. So it's bigger than the fuel rods. I mean, it goes back up the chain of command, then it goes, or the chain of production, I should say, it goes all the way through to the eventual, I guess, underground repository that someday may be built for high-level waste in this country. And in the meantime, dry casks is definitely a better way to do it than what we have with these overground or even underground water pools. So anyway, I wanted to remind us all of that. And the second thing I wanted to talk about actually is today's New England Journal of Medicine, sort of our medical journal of record around here, has an article, it's June 16th, called Short-Term and Long-Term Health Risks of Nuclear Power Plant Accidents. It's a timely article, and it's written by a group of radiation specialists, radiologists, I guess, but they're in the Department of Radiation Oncology at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. So it's a multiple author article, and in response to Fukushima. And I don't agree with everything that's in this article, but they do provide some useful information, and I want to share some of it with you in terms of radiation is not good for us. They also point out that there's already they say 17,000 and counting deaths in Japan from the earthquake and the tsunami. So the biggest portion of the disaster has already happened, and it wasn't because of radiation. It was because of the flooding and the tsunami and the people who were lost in that process. They also point out there are some heroes in the utility, was it TEPCO, that operated the three operating units, four, I guess it is, and three operating units, including one of the operators I think Dave mentioned that went down inside the containment vessel to figure out how to try to deal with things. And so there are at least 6, and I think now the count is 8, overexposed workers who were there at the time and who were trying to figure out what to do, and actually going into very dangerous situations. Some of them got really whopping doses. This article talks about radiation sickness as one of the first effects of a nuclear power plant accident. It talks a lot about Chernobyl, of course, where not only was there radiation sickness, there was, the explosion killed a bunch of people. But in Japan, there are some people who've already gotten a whopping dose and will probably be eventually called patients with radiation sickness. And then there's dozens more, actually, that have exceeded what would be the annual dose that a worker in a power plant would get in this country and probably in Japan as well, without having to be pulled off the job. And so I think actually that count is over 70 now. So the toll is rapidly rising for the workers at these plants. And then the unknown is still to be counted, and that's what's happened with especially iodine-131 and cesium emissions that have blown around in Japan. And actually it was high enough up in the atmosphere that it blew to the western part of North America. There are, I think it's too early to say what the ultimate effect of those exposures is going to be. This article talks about thyroid cancer after Chernobyl and the radioactive iodine from the Fukushima plants. There's no reason why it will also cause thyroid cancer, or maybe is already in the exposed population. And then after that, other solid tumors, and leukemia is another outcome that's likely in especially the most heavily exposed population. So those are the cancers, solid tumors of almost every type can be caused by ionizing radiation. The two that are most likely, given my experience anyway, are leukemia and thyroid cancer, and then from the Chernobyl experience, children especially are exquisitely at risk for thyroid cancer from radioactive iodine. So as if it wasn't bad enough from what we've already heard, there's probably more yet to be counted. These authors in the New England Journal of Medicine make some claims or some predictions of the size of the effect. They're not doing it from an epidemiologic point of view. They're actually clinicians, and they're actually advising physicians, really, if you see patients who are exposed in an accident, what would you be likely to see initially, and then what would you see in the longer term? So they don't really, I think, have a way of predicting the number of casualties from the Japanese experience, that they say will be between Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. I agree with that. I think it probably will be, and that's a huge range of effect, but we don't know yet, and we won't know for decades. So that's actually my story, is that there's a whole fuel cycle that's involved in the nuclear power plant process, and it goes way back up to the mining, which is, there are permits now to start up mining again in this country. And radiation is not good for you. And in my view, and I think I'm not the only person to say this, the National Academies of Science BEER 7, it's called, Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation 7th Committee, produced a report a few years ago where they also say there's no reason to say it's not a linear dose-response relationship, which is to say there's no safe dose. That ionizing radiation will increase the risk, especially of chronic illness such as cancer, from any dose above 0. And the higher the dose, of course, the worse the likely health effects. So I'm sorry I don't have good news to tell you, and I guess my only joke was about being bald, but that's the way it is. And, I will gladly take questions